Hey folks, welcome to Nate's Favorite Deck Building Games. If you haven't been following this series so far, the general premise is pretty simple. I'm a big fan of deck building games, and I want to show some of my favorites, along with how they work, how they compare to each other, and that sort of thing here on the show. Just sort of spread my love of this to those who might be interested in deck building games and haven't tried any, or who might be into them but may not have tried the ones that I'm particularly fond of. We've looked already at Star Realms, Ascension, and the DC deck building game. Now we turn our attention, finally, to the Marvel Legendary game from Upper Deck. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think Upper Deck and think deck building games, but they've got a really good product here. It's probably my favorite of the bigger deck building game series, although there are so-called Legendary Encounter sets that build on these mechanics and become more complex. These are definitely much more complex, though, than what you get with the DC deck building game until you start building in Crisis expansions and things like that, or Ascension until you really start combining a lot of sets, or from anything we see with Star Realms at this point. Really the only thing more complex than Legendary that I've seen up to this point that I've really been fond of are the Legendary Encounters games for Alien, Predator, and Firefly. So just keep that in mind. This is not necessarily going to be a deck building game for people who are just starting out, unless you really do have a good grasp of complex rules. That said, though, there is now a Legendary DXP app, which is a free app you can download and play on iOS devices and otherwise, which does have the ability to do a little small payment and unlock more decks and whatnot. It's a fantasy version of something that plays basically like Legendary if you're interested in trying out the game type with an app that does most of the work for you to make sure that you're able to understand it as you go. It's something that once you've caught on to it, you can play this and almost any other Legendary Encounters game with no problem, but it does take a little more time to get used to. So we're going to start here this episode looking at the core set, this giant core set here for the Legendary Marvel deck building game. Now, one thing of note here is that there is a playmat available out there for Legendary that has your setup information right here, has all the different game board spots that you're going to need to be able to play the game. The version of the core game that I've got actually comes with a game board that's a little bit easier for us to see here when using the iPad camera in this lighting. So we're going to focus on using the game board instead of the playmat, but just bear in mind that yes, a playmat does exist if you're looking for them. I found this one easily on eBay. This here is that game board, and yes, for those of you who have watched this series before, I did just have to raise up the tripod for the iPad here, because this is a much larger game board than we've dealt with any of the playmats for the other games that we've looked at. Hence, being so high up, you can actually see the very edge over there of the table, basically, that's underneath the Star Wars playmat that this board is now on. But this is the game board that comes with the initial set. What you'll notice here is all the same spots that were on that playmat. We'll look at exactly what they all do here momentarily as we start looking at the game itself. But this also moves that setup help, that setup reminder from over here up into the corner, gives you a reminder about turn order, and then gives you a place for the KO'd cards. The cards are basically knocked out of the game. So everything we need is right here, and nice and bright relative to the playmat to be able to actually see everything. That'll serve us well. Now, as with most deck building games, we're going to start our hands and our decks for everyone with two initial cards, each of which addresses one of two initial currencies. Just like you have two main currencies, say, in Ascension with runes and power, here we're going to have the currencies of recruit points and attack. And yes, we will have victory points in this game as well. Victory points, of course, aren't a currency, but a way of determining who is the victor at the end of the day. So, our initial hands, or our initial decks, are going to be composed of shield agents, which are a hero type, so it says shield agent, hero. That one there with the star tells you he's going to give you one recruit point. And then this down here is telling us the cost of the card to recruit. Since these are already in your deck to start with, they start with 0. They also have a little shield token up here, a shield icon, to tell us these are shield agents. A shield affiliation, that's going to come into play later. Lots of affiliation and types of cards and such. So, we have everything we need here for 5 players to each have a starting deck, and the starting deck begins with 8 shield agents each, so we have 40 of these. We're also going to have a starting card within those initial decks that's going to help us with attack. So here we have the Shield Trooper, also considered a hero, also from Shield, also a cost of 0 recruit points because it's already going to be in your deck. But over here, instead of it being the big star, the golden star with a number for recruit points, we have sort of a trio of red slashes, kind of like somebody's been slashed by Wolverine's claws, with a 1, which means he's going to give you 1 attack, or attack value, attack points. Usually we just call it 1 attack. Some people like to add an add-on to that word so they can refer to it instead of the attack action, they can refer to attack points, attack number, whatever. But everybody's going to start out with 4 of these. We have, again, enough for up to 5 players, so we have 20 of these in the initial box. Like with many deck building games, we're also going to want to have some always available cards, cards that we can acquire if it turns out that we don't have the ability or want to acquire any of the cards in whatever row is going to be our acquisition row this time. In this case, the always available card that we have is the Shield Officer. Notice kind of a trend here. Underneath it says Maria Hill. Okay, so it's Maria Hill as a character here. We have the shield icon again, same affiliation as those other 2 we've looked at. In this case, you're going to have to pay 3 recruit points in order to acquire her for your deck. And then when played, she provides 2 recruit points of her own. These wind up sitting over here where it says Shield for your always available cards. Now, just like the DC deck building game has vulnerabilities that could be in your deck, things that are basically useless cards that could come up that are just taking up space and keeping you from drawing better cards, and weaknesses, things that you draw that actually wind up, again, being kind of useless but theoretically hurt you. This game kind of combines the concepts into a set of useless cards that don't actually start inside your starting deck, but do get acquired kind of like weaknesses in the DC deck building game. Those are wounds. Okay? And just like the Shield Officer over here, Maria Hill, of which there are 30, we have 30 wound cards, all identical, which are going to sit over here in the wound spot until drawn. Now, you might recall that in Ascension, every once in a while, one of the cards we might defeat or acquire might have a card underneath it that's a treasure card, like an energy shard, for instance, in Rise of Vigil. Well, this game's also going to have some cards that could wind up stuck underneath others, that could wind up being acquired as you go along, perhaps, depending on your circumstances. In this case, it's a 30-card deck of right now the same type of card. So other expansions will wind up swapping it out and adding some variants to this, but right now it's all just 1 of each, known as Bystanders. And the Bystanders also introduce another item in here for us, this little teeny tiny number over here in sort of this reddish-orange circle. That's your victory points. The Bystanders, until anybody acquires them, or they wind up needing to be used, go into the little Bystanders stack over there. Now, usually in a deck building game, you've only got 1 row. Call it the lineup, call it the center row, call it the trade row, whatever. It's just 1 row that's going to have a bunch of stuff in it. And much of the time, if you've got a game that has 2 different main currencies, what you're going to be able to acquire or defeat with those currencies is still going to wind up essentially being there in that row. So, for example, with Ascension, if you got something you can acquire with runes, it's sitting in that row. If it's something you can defeat with your power, it's also sitting in that row. In this case, Legendary does sit a little bit differently, and they divide it up. So the things that you will recruit with your recruit points are going to be down here in the so-called headquarters as 1 row, whereas the villains that you can defeat using your attack ability or your attack points, those are going to be up here in the so-called city. So we have the headquarters for recruiting, the city for battling, and you'll notice that the city in this case, the order is going to matter sometimes. And each of the slots in this row, each of these 5 slots, there's 5 in both, is labeled. So we have the sewers, the bank, the rooftops, the streets, and the bridge. The idea is going to be that we will have a villain deck, just like you have a center deck or a main deck or whatever in any other deck building game. And when the time comes to put a card into this row, it's going to go into this first slot. Your villains will enter the city through the sewers. And then each turn, as a new card has to come out, it's going to take the sewer spot and scoot everything to the left. Okay? So if there's already somebody in the sewers, then whichever one comes out bumps that person to the bank, and now that new card is in the sewers. And it keeps scooting them over and scooting them over when it's necessary. So there's a blank space, it might scoot a couple, but it's not going to scoot the ones past the blank space because it's just scooting into the blank space. Once someone is pushed out off of the bridge, they become known as an escaped villain, and there's usually an escape ability that winds up being triggered, but they wind up getting stuck in this escaped villains stack. But everybody you're going to fight, except for the mastermind we'll look at here in a moment, is going to make their way from the villain deck through the city, going leftward, until eventually escaping if they're not defeated. The hero deck, meanwhile, that you're going to be able to recruit from is just going to be refilling 5 different spots for heroes down here in the headquarters. They won't move around. It's just going to be a matter of they're sitting down there. You acquire it, it just gets replaced immediately. Now, it's how you get the villain deck and hero deck that starts to really show how this game is a lot more customizable than most deck building games. That also applies to our schemes and masterminds here. Think of these 4 items here as the things that really make this a heavily customizable thematic game, which is great, but also means that setup takes a little bit longer than normal. First off, you're going to have a mastermind. This mastermind is the main villain that is overseeing whatever scheme it is that is going on right now that your heroes are trying to stop. Every mastermind is going to basically have 5 cards. Okay, Red Skull here is an example. We have one card that just has their name and says mastermind. Okay, that's the one that's going to be sitting on top over here in our mastermind slot. And in this case it says Red Skull always leads Hydra, Master Strike. Each player KOs a hero from their hand. We'll talk about what a Master Strike is later. Notice there he's got an attack rating there in this corner of 7. You're going to have to build up 7 attack to defeat him. But sitting underneath him will be 4 different cards that instead have their own name, like Endless Resources, and underneath says Mastermind Tactic Red Skull, or whoever the mastermind is. There are 4 mastermind tactics per mastermind. And each time you defeat that mastermind for 7, you're going to randomly pull one of these 4 cards out from under him, and anytime you try to attack a villain, a lot of times it'll say fight, and there'll be something you have to do during that fight when you're taking them out. And in this case, you'll randomly pick one of the 4, the fight thing will happen, and you defeated that tactic. Your general goal, depending on how you play out the end of the game, we'll talk about that later, is to defeat all 4 of the mastermind tactics, which means defeating your mastermind 4 times, each time having the effect of whatever that fight ability happens to be. But those will be upside down underneath the mastermind's own card over here in the mastermind slot. The core set comes with Red Skull and Magneto if you're fond of the X-Men, and Loki, if you're particularly fond of Thor and the Asgardians and all, and of course, Doctor Doom, if you're particularly fond of, say, Fantastic Four. You're only ever going to use one mastermind at a time, though. So your choice of mastermind, that's a level of customizability. Then you also have schemes that are going on, okay? The game itself comes with a set of schemes, comes with 8 different schemes, 8 different scenarios that you may be playing. Each one says scheme, along with up at the top just having a name of some kind. So in this case, replace Earth's leaders with killbots. Scheme. You have your setup, which tells you how to set up the game itself. Special rules, if there are any. Twist means if someone pulls a scheme twist card, which we'll talk about momentarily, what happens? And then evil wins. Win what? It is possible that before the heroes can take out the mastermind 4 times, that evil winds up pulling off what they're trying to do, and evil wins the game. So you're sort of fighting the clock here, or fighting against the game itself, so to speak. All players are heroes, Not necessarily going up against each other, just sort of competing with each other to be the best hero, but together trying to stop evil from carrying out their plot. Because if evil does, then hey, heroes all lose. So in this case, it says setup. 5 twists, 3 additional twists next to this scheme, 18 total bystanders in the villain deck. We'll talk about that again momentarily. Special rules. Bystander in the villain deck counts as a killbot. Villains with attack equal to the number of twists next to this scheme. Twist, put the twist next to this scheme. Evil wins if 5 killbots escape. That's a lot of stuff that won't make any sense right now. It will later. But all that you need for a somewhat unique game experience will be on your scheme card, because they are all different. So you're just going to pull one scheme, whatever it might be, and stick it over there in your scheme slot. The other ones get put away. And further expansions do add more schemes. So you have a customizable game in terms of which mastermind you're going after, a customizable game in terms of which scheme that mastermind is trying to pull off. You're also going to have the game customized based on the villain deck and the hero deck. So let's start with the villain deck. The first thing you're going to need to do is look at the scheme and see what it says in terms of setup, in terms of how many scheme twists are in the villain deck. I'm going to use the one called Midtown Bank Robbery, the one I just randomly grabbed and sat here, and it tells me that in the setup, we need 8 twists. So I'm going to grab a stack of cards here called Scheme Twists. There are 11 of them. It says I need 8, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The other ones I won't need, and I'll use those 8 to start building my villain deck before I do any shuffling or anything. Now what happens next depends on how many players we have, and that's where this little handy table comes in handy up here in the corner. It's also in the rule book. For the number of players, technically you can start with 1, but the table starts with 2. If you want to do solo play, you just look in the rule book for information on that. But you have players 2 through 5, and depending on how many of those players you have, that determines how many villain groups, henchman groups, and bystanders will wind up in your villain deck. Unless, of course, the scheme overrides that somehow, and this one actually does. It says that you have to have 12 total bystanders in the villain deck. So since we're going to have 12 of those anyway, I'll go ahead and assume that we're playing with 5 players, because the bystander total for 5 players is 12. That way the numbers wind up matching anyway. So for my villain deck, I'm going to need to pull a total of 12 of my bystanders to add to it too. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay? That's those for the villain deck. The other ones just go up here in case they're needed otherwise. It also tells me very early on in the setup instructions that I need to grab these Master Strikes and put 5 Master Strikes into the villain deck. You might say, what's a Master Strike? There's not a lot on there. It just says Master Strike. What's the deal? Well, if we go back to our guy here, our Mastermind, which I apparently put on there incorrectly. My bad as far as the layer I put it on. It's supposed to have the Mastermind on top there. If you look at the Mastermind card, one of the things it says is Master Strike. Okay, so when one of these cards gets pulled out, you do whatever it says for Master Strike, which will be different depending on the Mastermind. In this case, each player KOs a hero from their hand. In other words, you take one of the heroes that's in your hand and stick it into the KO area and it's out of the game. But that's specific to Red Skull. But in order to trigger those, we need Master Strikes. So we're going to take 5 of them and stick them in the villain deck. Now, we're going to check and see again, based on how many players we have, how many villain groups or henchman groups we're going to need. But what on earth is a villain group or a henchman group? Well, a villain group is going to be a type of card, like this one, that says some name at the top, in this case, Destroyer, and says villain, so you know what type it is, enemies of Asgard. There'll be 8 cards for that villain group that all say some name, but then villains, enemies of Asgard. They all go into the game together. And they'll have some ability, usually marked for fight, so if you fight them, something happens. They'll often also say something for escape, which means that if this villain makes it all the way across the city to the bridge and then continues on to escape, something happens when they make their escape. Villains, though, come in these packs of 8, or these groups of 8, usually with 1 card there's 3 copies of, 2 cards there are 2 copies of each, and then one card where only one version of it exists. But we're going to need, according to our table up here for 5 players, 4 villain groups. Thankfully, the starting set comes with 7 for us to choose from. We've got Enemies of Asgard, Masters of Evil, that's 2, Radiation, makes 3, then we have Hydra, and notice we have to include Hydra. Why? Because on our mastermind it says, always leads Hydra. If there is a group of villains that are always led by that mastermind, they must be one of the ones included. Alright, so that's 4 different groups, but just to let you know which other ones are in that starter set, we also have the Brotherhood, the Skrulls, and then the last one, the Spider Foes. Okay, so Spider-Man villains. These, though, aren't going to wind up being used because we've already got our 4. Then we've got what are called henchmen that get added to the villain deck, which are slightly less powerful enemies. They're all basically the same card 10 times each that go in as blocks of 10. So in this case, again, I look at number of players, 5. How many henchmen groups? It tells me 2. This set comes with 4 to choose from. I've got the Doombot Legion. Again, all the cards are the exact same. So we'll put Doombot Legion in there. And then we have Hand Ninjas. We'll put the Hand Ninjas in there. And then just for sake of argument, since we have our 2, what else does it include? We've got the Savage Land Mutants. And we've got the Sentinels. Again, these cards will have some type of attack value in the corner that you have to beat or meet in order to defeat them. Usually some type of fight ability for when you fight them, trying to beat them for the 3. It could also have an escape value. This one does not, just in case they escape, something happens. And generally there'll be a victory point there as a value for the card. But all the exact same. And we're going to take these 2 and put them out of the game because we've already got our 2. So just to be clear, again, Shield Officer, it's always all of them from the core set. Mastermind is always 1 Mastermind with their 4 Mastermind tactics flipped down underneath. There's always 1 Scheme. You always use all of your wounds. And then your bystanders over here are just whatever's left that's not in your villain deck. But the villain deck is the single most complex deck that we have within this game, because it's going to have a total of however many scheme twists the scheme tells you to add. It's going to have 5 Master Strikes, and then it's going to have however many villain groups, henchmen groups, and bystanders are required by the number of players, with the exception of when there's a slight change thanks to the setup described on the scheme card itself. So a pretty big deck here, and we're going to wind up taking this and shuffling it to create our villain deck. Then it's going to go face down as the villain deck. But we're still not done customizing. We've got customizing based on Mastermind, based on Scheme, based on villain deck. Now what about the hero deck? Well, you are a hero or someone who is coordinating heroes and recruiting heroes, but again, you're only starting with your shield agents and shield troopers that are in your starting deck. Yeah, you're going to be fighting enemies as they try to make their way across the city to try to take them out, but when you defeat them, they're just defeated. You're not recruiting your enemies to fight alongside you. Instead, you're going to use your recruit points, remember, from the little star-looking number over here. You're going to use your recruit points to try to bring more heroes in to help you save the day. Those are going to come from the headquarters, which has its own deck over here called the hero deck. It's going to tell us up here, based on the number of players, how many heroes are we going to use. In this case, the number of players is 5. So we're going to use 6 different heroes to form our hero deck. Now your hero groups, again, they all have the same legendary back here. The hero groups are going to come in groups of 14. And this game actually has 15 different heroes to choose from. These have a little more to their cards than what we're used to with some of these others. Bear in mind that in each of your hero groups, in general, you're going to have 1 card that appears once, 1 that appears 3 times, and then 2 of them that appear 5 times each. Okay? So to some degree, we're giving ourselves a rarity issue here to look at. Now, they're all going to say some title, in this case, a high-stakes jackpot. Then underneath, it's going to have the name of the hero, Gambit. So all 14 cards labeled as Gambit go together and enter the game as a block. We have an affiliation or faction symbol up here in the corner. In this case, a little X for X-Men. And then we're going to have these different symbols here that are going to tell you what type of ability or type of hero it is. Now for the record, again, the faction symbols are up here in the corner. And for the X-Men, this core set includes Gambit, Storm, Cyclops, Wolverine, Rogue, and Emma Frost. Then we also have heroes from the Avengers. We have Hulk, Hawkeye, Thor, Iron Man, Black Widow, and Captain America. Then also for S.H.I.E.L.D., just like our starting cards, and our S.H.I.E.L.D. officer in the corner, Maria Hill, we have Nick Fury. For the Spider-Friends faction, we only have one right now in this starter set. We've got Spider-Man. Then we have one here that has no affiliation, and that's Deadpool. You're also going to have a hero type for many of the cards. They're going to help you do combos. So under your faction symbol, there'll be another little symbol oftentimes on your hero cards. There's a green sort of Hulk fist there that means it is a strength hero. We have this red quasi yin-yang kind of symbol that has arrows pointing toward the center that is covert heroes. We have this thing that I always say looks kind of like a seashell, but it's actually basically a profile of a person's head. Those are your instinct heroes there in sort of yellow-orange. We have this blue one. It's kind of hard to see, but it looks kind of like a crosshairs. That is your ranged heroes. And then this little black, white, and gray symbol here that looks kind of like a computer chip. That's going to denote your tech heroes. In general, each hero card, aside from having its name, the name of the hero, the faction, the hero type, is also going to have some cost in terms of recruit points down in the corner. And over on the left, it's going to give you something, either with the star behind it, recruit points, or with the slash behind it there, attack points, or attack as they call it. Then most of the time there'll be text that happens when you play that card, and sometimes you'll find that the text might change one of your other values on the card. So for instance, in this case, it says 4+. You always get 4 attack when you play this card, but if you look at the text here, it says, reveal the top card of your deck. You get plus attack equal to that card's cost. So say the card that I reveal has a cost of 3 recruit points, then I get to add 3 onto the 4 to make that 7. They always have either an asterisk or a little plus or something there to help remind you, hey, don't forget to look at the card text, because the number may actually wind up being different than the printed amount. But according to this, we have a certain amount of heroes we are supposed to add based on the number of players. In this case, it is 6. So we'll have, say, Gambit, and Spider-Man, and we'll add Deadpool, so that's 3. Nick Fury makes 4. Captain America makes 5. And then let's toss in Storm for 6. Gonna take all these cards, gonna shuffle them up, and then they will be put face down as our hero deck. And we are pretty much ready to play. So to start the game, our villain deck is shuffled. We don't do anything with it just yet. Our hero deck is shuffled. We're going to need to pull 5 cards from the hero deck to fill out our headquarters here. So the headquarters is full. 5 different heroes you might be able to recruit at different prices. 4, 3, 4, 3, and 2. Now, we need to make sure that everybody's got their hands drawn. Everybody is starting, again, with 8 of these S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and 4 of these S.H.I.E.L.D. troopers. They're going to shuffle those together and each draw a hand of 6 cards, which of course means we're going to be leaving 6 cards sitting there in their deck for their next turn. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that our player has drawn 4 S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and 2 S.H.I.E.L.D. troopers as their hand. Now the turns actually begin. Step 1 is to reveal the first card of the villain deck by putting it into the sewers face up. Yes, that is different than we're going to see for Legendary Encounters games, which put them face down. In regular Marvel Legendary, they go face up. Now, what's going to happen when that card comes out from the villain deck kind of depends on what type of card it is. Okay? If it is a simple villain or henchman card, then it's going to go face up right there in the sewers. But you do have to check its card text, because if it has an ambush ability, then the moment that it comes out, it does whatever that ambush ability is. Okay? It will still say fight, but that's only when you're trying to kill it. Okay? And again, escape is only if they escape from the other end. You might have pulled a Master Strike. If you pull a Master Strike, then you're going to have to do whatever the Mastermind card says as the Master Strike, as I mentioned before, and then this is gone. It's KO'd. Maybe what you pull out of there is a bystander card, one of these innocent people caught in the crossfire. Well, assuming that you actually have a villain sitting over here, the bystander goes underneath them. And then when you defeat that villain, in this case for 6 attack, then you also get to put the bystander into your victory pile. So you get the 1 victory point from the bystander. If by chance, let's say there isn't a villain sitting there in the sewers, then in that case what's going to happen is that your bystander is going to wind up getting stuck underneath the mastermind, and the next time somebody defeats one of those mastermind tactics, they get to rescue that bystander. Oftentimes, though, a bystander will have something special that's going on based on the scheme, so always make sure you're keeping track of the scheme instructions. It is also possible that you'll pull a Scheme Twist, the last of the types of cards that we have inside that deck. A Scheme Twist means check out your scheme card, do whatever the twist says. Oftentimes, you'll have a situation where a certain number of twists happening ends the game because that's the evil wins win condition on the card, but not every time. Now, if we pull a Master Strike, or we pull a Scheme Twist, or we pull a Bystander, it doesn't scoot anybody over inside the city there. But if we were to pull, say, another villain or henchman, which is another enemy we're going to have to fight, then that is going to go into the sewers and scoot everybody else off to the left. And that will keep happening over and over. Now, say it's like this, though, right? There's a blank space. New villain comes out. It scoots this one over to take its place, but it doesn't have to scoot this one over because it did have that blank space to go into. Eventually, they will keep being scooted over. I haven't shuffled this, so I'm just going to grab some from the middle since I know I'll have some villains here to use to show you. Let's say we're in a situation here where all 5 slots are taken up by villains. Maybe they got some bystanders underneath them, possibly. In fact, let's go ahead and stick a bystander under this guy, like we saw before. And now, we, at the beginning of the next turn, pull out another card from the villain deck. It's an actual villain. It's going to have to go in this space and scoot them over. What this is going to mean is that in the process of scooting them over, this guy has now just escaped. Because he has nowhere else to go, he's going to go into our escaped villains pile, and if he has an ability that says escape, that's when it's going to happen. So he's escaping. Well, wait, he's got a bystander underneath him. There is a penalty for that. The bystander winds up being gone. You didn't wind up saving them, which means that as a penalty, every single player has to discard 1 card from their current hand. Then the bystander just goes with the escaped villain there into the escaped villain's stack. Also, because you failed to stop that villain from escaping, even if that villain doesn't even have an escape ability, you still wind up taking a penalty as a whole, because one of the cards in the headquarters that is 6 or less winds up getting KO'd. So let's say this one gets KO'd, it's gone from the game, but it is immediately replaced by a new card. And notice all of that is happening before you even have a chance to play anything. As soon as a turn starts, the very first thing that happens is 1 card from that villain stack flips over. If it's a villain or henchman, it enters the city, scoots everything else over that needs to scoot, and sometimes will cause something to escape. If it's a bystander, it goes underneath either a henchman, villain, or the mastermind, depending on the circumstances, or it could be a Master Strike or Scheme Twist that's going to wind up causing you to turn to one of those 2 cards over here to figure out what to do next. But that's all before you ever have a chance to play anything. Now, what actually happens on your turn is very much like what you would expect from pretty much any deck building game. Again, we've got our hand there that we already drew for our character. Again, we have 2 shield troopers and 4 shield agents in our hand. We're going to play these cards in any order that we like, but order will make a difference every once in a while. we're going to play these cards to build up some attack power and some recruit power or recruit points to be able to defeat and acquire cards, very much like any deck building game. So it won't matter in this case what order they're in. There's no combo effects or anything going on that we can talk about in a moment. So we've got 2 cards that give us 1 attack each, and then we've got 4 cards that give us 1 recruit each, so we have 4 recruit and 2 power that we can do something with. Well, for recruit, we can then spend up to 4, right, in any combination to acquire cards here. So let's say I want to acquire, I don't know, let's say I want to acquire Card Shark. I'm going to spend my 4, I acquire him, stick him in my discard pile, I immediately refill the headquarters, but now I'm out of recruit points, so there's no more that I could recruit. But in theory, I could keep recruiting until I run out of those points. Now, right now, he's got 2 attack. There's nothing he can do because every one of these has an attack value that is higher than 2. But let's reverse this. Let's say perhaps that instead of pulling 4 recruit points and 2 attack, maybe he pulled 4 attack and only 2 recruit points. So he might recruit Spider-Man instead, because he costs 2, but he could use those 4 attack to go after this card or this card that have that attack value of 4. So let's say he goes after the Frost Giant from the Enemies of Asgard. Well, as soon as you attack, you know you're going to defeat him, or should defeat him, because you've got enough attack to take out that 4 of his, but he has a fight ability, as most do. It says, fight. Each player reveals a ranged hero or gains a wound. So you take him out, but in the process of taking him out to put him in your victory pile for his 2 victory points here, he manages to do some damage, so everybody needs to reveal, basically use your hand or the cards you've played just now to show that, yes, you've got a ranged hero in there somewhere, or you wind up having to put one of those wounds into your discard pile that goes in your deck. Again, something that winds up sitting in your deck, not able to really do anything when you have it in your hand. It just takes up space. Again, once defeated, it goes in your victory pile, though, and you don't just refill the space. It just means that in this case, the bridge is empty. The next time that a card comes out of the villain deck at the beginning of someone's turn, if it's a henchman or a villain, it's going to scoot everybody down, and eventually this guy's going to be the one scooted into the bridge. Now let's talk about combos, okay? And I'm not talking, in this case, about the yummy little snacks. Let's talk about combos. Let's look at our Nick Fury card here, high-tech weaponry, and our Spider-Man card here, which is web shooters. Let's say that we've got both of these in our hand. We've acquired them on some previous turn by spending 2 and 3 recruit points. They went to our discard pile, and we got to a point where our discard pile got shuffled, became our new deck. We drew them into our hand. We're ready to play them on this turn, okay? Again, remember that they have these types up here based on their class. These are both tech heroes in this case. Now, when I play Spider-Man, it just says, rescue a bystander. Reveal the top card of your deck. If that card costs 2 recruit points or less, draw it. Okay, no big deal. But notice what's up with Nick Fury's. He does have text there to go beyond just the 2 that he gets for attack, but notice it's got that symbol, that text symbol there. What that means is that if on that turn you have already played another card that is of that type, then you also get that ability as well. So I got to make sure that I play web shooters first, so that when I then break out high-tech weaponry, it will see, so to speak, the fact that I've already played a tech card on this turn and give me, where it says, you get +1 attack. So he goes from 2 attack to 3 attack because I played web shooters. Now, eventually we'll see this happen with faction symbols as well, not just the type of hero that it is, but it's always about matching up the symbol to something you've already played that turn. But it only does happen once. If I played like 3 or 4 tech heroes and then pulled this guy out, it's not like I'm going to get 2 or 3 different times of that happening. It triggers once, but it has to see at least one of those tech heroes already played before it happens. Otherwise, you just get the 2. Here's an example of that other kind, the X-Men United card for Cyclops. Notice there that the ability that triggers here has the X-Men symbol instead of a hero type symbol. So in this case, if I played another X-Men affiliation card this turn, then I get whatever it says. So I'm playing cards from my hand. I'm using attack to defeat the characters that are up in the city. If I defeat them, they go in my victory pile to give me victory points. So do the bystanders that I manage to rescue if I take out one that has a bystander with them. I'm using recruit points to recruit heroes from the headquarters. When I recruit them, they go into my discard pile to eventually be shuffled into my deck. I'm also trying to eventually get up enough attack points that instead of attacking somebody here in the city, I can attack the mastermind. Again, you attack the mastermind for whatever their value is, randomly pick one of the tactics underneath, you defeat that tactic, do whatever the fight says, it goes into your victory pile just like otherwise. Once I've done all that, my turn is over, so I'm going to put all the cards that I played this turn into my discard pile, discard any cards still in my hand that I didn't play this turn, like maybe I got a wound sitting there or something, and then I'm going to need to draw 6 new cards. And let's say I draw 2 cards, but there's no more in my deck. That's when I shuffle up my discard pile to make a new deck and draw the other 4. That works just like any other deck building game. As soon as you have to draw something out of your deck, but have no deck, you must shuffle the discard pile to make a new deck. That's how all of these more powerful cards that are entering the game by being acquired and going into your discard pile wind up entering your deck to be able to be used in future hands. Again, your heroes will win the game if they defeat the mastermind 4 times to take out each of their 4 mastermind tactics. Evil will win, and all players will lose whenever the evil wins condition from the scheme, if there is one, winds up being met. Assuming the heroes do win, the big hero of the day is whoever has the most victory points on the cards in their victory pile. You might say, well, why not count victory points that are in my deck? Notice that the heroes that you recruit don't have victory points on them. The only ones that actually have victory points are the ones that are going to wind up being in the villain deck, or the bystanders, or the mastermind, and those are all ones that wind up going into your victory pile when you get them not into your deck. Now, just a couple of other quick notes. Let's say that you've got a wound sitting there in your hand. It is useless. You can heal wounds. Okay? If you don't recruit any heroes or defeat any villains on your turn, you may KO all the wounds from your hand. So say I'm sitting there with a hand that's got a couple wounds in it, and the only attack and recruit points that I've got aren't going to get me anything I'm going to find particularly useful. I might hold off and not attack anybody, not recruit anybody, so that when we get to the end of that turn, I can say, aha, I'm just going to take all those wounds that are sitting in my hand and KO them to get rid of them. That way they're not clogging up my deck with useless cards. Notice, though, that unlike weaknesses from the DC deck building game, there is no negative effect on your victory points or anything like that. Remember, a wound is in your deck. Deck cards don't have victory points or anything. So this is a lot more similar to vulnerabilities in the DC deck building game. It's just that these don't start in your deck like they do. They get drawn in by certain things that happen. Now, you might also say, now, wait a second. I know that in a lot of deck building games, if there's some kind of line that you've got to refill from a deck, something happens, usually the end of the game or something, if those decks run out or one of those decks were to run out. So what happens here? In this case, if either the villain deck or the hero deck runs out of cards, either one, doesn't matter which, then you finish out the current turn, and as soon as that current turn is over, then all the gameplay stops, and basically what has happened is you survived the scheme, but you didn't stop the mastermind. So the mastermind has gotten away, but, you didn't die, and the city didn't get completely destroyed. So you do still count up your victory points, and someone wins an individual victory, even if the heroes in general only survive rather than scoring a victory for them as a group. Now, there is one last thing that might happen in your game. It depends on if you and the friends you're playing with actually want to do it, because it is optional. And that's a thing called the final showdown. Technically, the heroes have won as soon as they've taken out all 4 of the mastermind tactics that are sitting there underneath the mastermind by defeating the mastermind those 4 times for whatever his attack value happens to be. You could also do a final showdown as soon as you have that 4th mastermind tactic defeated. You go ahead and have the player that just defeated the last of those 4 discard the cards in their hand and that they've played and draw a new hand of 6 cards. Now everybody's sitting there in theory with their hands waiting for the next thing to happen. Each player then plays all the cards that they've got that they want to play and builds up attack and recruit points. But they're not going to use it to attack or recruit. Instead, you take the total of both. So say you got 5 attack and 3 recruit. That gives you a total of 8. And whichever player has the highest total out of the cards from their hand, okay, not their deck or anything, but from their hand, whichever one has the highest total winds up being the final showdown winner and gets to actually put the Mastermind card itself into their victory pile, which gives another, in this case, 5 victory points beyond the victory points that are tied into the 4 Mastermind tactics that have been sitting underneath it. If it winds up being tied, the ones who are tied just draw another hand of 6 and do it all over again, over and over, until there is finally just one final showdown winner. That tie-breaking final showdown is actually called a super showdown, just to, add more confusing terminology into the game. So again, this is a really complicated game if you're only used to playing something like the DC deck building game, Star Realms, or Ascension. But I find it's very rewarding because it's a lot more complex, which makes it a lot more interesting. And it is very much customizable because of how much we're customizing based on scheme, Mastermind, villain deck, and hero deck as we go along with a few other things we'll see as we look at other expansions along the way. Personally, I think Legendary is probably my single favorite deck building game, with the exception perhaps of one of the Legendary Encounters games that we'll take a look at. But as one that's an ongoing series of games, Legendary for me is the king of the hill. It's more complex, more setup time, but more rewarding overall.